timeless grass aerodrome of Old Wharton in the heart of rural England, home of the unique Shuttleworth collection. In ideal conditions, some of the world's rarest aeroplanes will once again take to the air. The collection was begun by Richard Ormond Shuttleworth in 1928. He was killed in 1940 whilst on a training sortie for the Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve. But the collection continues as a trust in his memory. Dating right back to the first decade of the 20th century is this 1910 Deperdasser. The collection spans a period from the very birth of powered flight through 2 world wars and into the second half of the 20th century. This 1910 Bristol box kite biplane, based on Henry Farman's successful Farman 3, leaves its pilot completely exposed. It sports a pusher propeller, situated immediately behind the pilot's seat. But many early aeroplanes were monoplanes, like this Deperdasser, with its 35 horsepower and Zani rotary engine and totally covered fuselage. This became a popular aeroplane with flying schools in Great Britain and on the continent, as it was able to sustain steady flight at a reasonable and safe altitude. Another early monoplane owned by the Shuttleworth collection is the 1912 Blackburn. But both it and this Deperdasser have no control surfaces at all on their wings. Instead, their wings are warped, that is, bent to give the pilot lateral control. As the Blackburn awaits, the Deperdasser is carefully towed out from where it's been on view to its takeoff position at the end of the runway. Although it's common practice at these air displays to start engines whilst the aeroplanes are at their parked positions, the very earliest flying machines, like this Deperdasser and the Blackburn, are started instead at the end of the runway. An anxious moment, but one eagerly awaited. And the Deperdasser will make a short, straight-line flight along the runway. However, the Bristol box kite makes a more majestic departure. Unlike the monoplanes, the box kite uses ailerons to achieve lateral control. But having no balance cables, they hang limp when the machine is stationary. This box kite is not an original, but a faithful replica, built for the film Those Magnificent Men and Their Flying Machines. Even so, it can only be flown in conditions of almost complete calm. Now it's the turn of the Blackburn. This is not a replica, but a 1912 original, and is in fact the oldest British aeroplane still in flying condition. After its elongated hop, the Deperdasser returns under its own power, while the Blackburn, powered by a mere 50 horsepower Gnome rotary engine, makes a stately pass overhead. box kite's engine, like its airframe, is not of pre-World War I vintage, but is in fact a modern 100-horsepower Continental. Box kites were originally built as civil aeroplanes, but in March 1911, an order came from the War Office. The aeroplane was going into battle. Here's the Blackburn again. Now another replica takes to the air. This time the Avro triplane. While the Blackburn, its all too short display over, makes ready to land back at Old Warden. The Avro triplane, a product of one of Britain's most famous aeroplane pioneers, A.V. Roe, broke with the norm by having a third set of wings, which it was hoped would produce more lift. Few of these aeroplanes were ever built, and though successful as flying machines, they were used only for research and development. The high aspect ratio, the ratio of wing length to width, certainly proved its worth, for it was from the experience gained from this design that Avro developed the successful 504K, which we'll see a little later on. This aeroplane has a control wheel for the pilot, and in common with the Blackburn and the Depadassa, control is achieved by warping the wings, this time just the top two. Like this, the collection's Bristol box kite, the Avro triplane is a replica, built for the film Those Magnificent Men and Their Flying Machines. It was based on an original in the Science Museum and built by the Hampshire Aeroplane Club at Eastleigh. The coming of the First World War saw a rapid acceleration in the rate of aeroplane design. And this one, the Sopwith Pup, was developed to be flown from the deck of a ship at sea. Now, to save the weight required for a flywheel, the propeller of the Pup is bolted to its rotary engine, so both propeller and engine rotate together. As Avro, represented here by the triplane, was to become a name synonymous with warplanes like the Anson, Lancaster, Vulcan, so the name Sopwith was soon to be stamped on history as the forerunner of the Hurricane, Hunter and Harrier. As the triplane lands, we come to the end of the first era of carefree flying. The war was to change forever, not only the shape of the aeroplane, but its role in battle. Initially used only for observation, The aeroplane now became an independent fighting machine as well. In 1917, with the availability of the French 150 horsepower Hispano-Suiza engine, the Royal Aircraft Factory at Farnborough designed and built the SE-5A. The highly maneuverable and very successful Sopwith Pup taxis out for takeoff. As the SE-5A's engine is thoroughly warmed up. The Pup. Now it's the turn of the SE-5A. The Sopwith Pup passes overhead. The SE-5A takes off. One of the most successful fighters of World War I, the SE-5A was armed with two forward-firing Vickers machine guns. These were mounted on top of the fuselage, and using synchronizing gear, they fired through the spinning propeller. There was also a Lewis gun mounted centrally on the top wing. This was fired with the aid of a cable running down into the cockpit. But to reload, the pilot had to stand up and pull the gun down on its mount into the reload position. This SE-5A, restored by apprentices at the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, has had to be re-engined and now uses a 200 horsepower Wolseley Viper, a license-built version of the original Hispano-Suiza. Once more, the Sopwith Pup.
Yeah, just unexpected.
On the other side of the lines in 1917, one of the many aeroplanes designed in Germany was the Luftverkehrsgesellschaft LVG C6, armed with a movable parabellum gun and a fixed Spandau gun. Power came from the rugged inline Benz engine. In contrast to the LVG, the Pup was armed only with a single Vickers gun firing through the propeller. This last surviving flying example of a Pup, stablemate of the more famous Camel, turns to land back at Old Warden at the end of its display. The LVG, as with all vintage aeroplanes, despite much loving care and attention, can sometimes be a reluctant starter.
When you're ready then, on the word go. Right, 1, 2, 3, go!
The SE-5A takes a passing interest as the LVG, at last, bursts into life. But perhaps the most effective aeroplane of World War I was the two-seat Bristol fighter F-2B. The Rolls-Royce Falcon engine in the Collections fighter is the oldest Rolls-Royce aero engine still flying anywhere in the world. It was armed with a fixed Vickers gun for the pilot and one or sometimes two Lewis guns on a scarf ring for use by the observer. Passing salute from the SE-5A, the Bristol sets off. The German LVG. Followed by the Bristol fighter. The SE-5A, joined now by the LVG. And the Bristol F-2B. The display continues with a gentle ballet of mock combat. The First World War saw the birth of a new service, the RAF, and later it was to require training aeroplanes. The Avro 504K was soon to fill this role, and that in turn was replaced by this machine, the Avro Tutor. Built in 1933, this is the world's sole surviving Tutor. Whilst the Tutor is being prepared for its display, let's return for a moment to the latter days of World War I. The SE-5A, LBG and Bristol fighter return in formation. The Tutor is started. The German LVG returns and lands. Followed by the Bristol fighter. Leaving the SE-5A alone to provide its own private display. The Tutor has warmed up its Armstrong-Siddeley Lynx engine and is at last ready for takeoff. Another Avro, this time the 504K, and the Tutor's predecessor as an RAF trainer, has its 110 horsepower Lerone engine manually started. As this earlier film shows, the 504K is not so easy to start in cold, wet weather. The collection's early Huck starter, basically a converted Model T Ford, is brought into service. But back to the display. Let's now fly with the Avro Tutor. Avro 504K takes off. The 504K makes a final pass. Now it's the Hawker Heinz turn to be started with the hugs. The tutor makes a last salute. The tutor lands, to be followed by the other Avro, the 504K. But flying vintage aeroplanes is only part of the Shuttleworth collection's many activities. Deep within the confines of the workshops, we see the collection's DH-88 Comet of 1934 undergoing painstaking restoration. Filmed here in 1979, this aeroplane was finally restored to flying condition by British Aerospace at Hatfield. Meanwhile, outside, the Hind takes off. Also from the Hawker stable is the 1928 Tomtit, with its 150 horsepower Armstrong Siddeley Mongoose engine. This Tomtit, the last to be built, is the only survivor of its type. The Tomtit is started up. While the Hawker Hind holds the attention of the crowd, the Tomtit, aided by its two wingmen, is taxied down the runway in preparation for takeoff. Nearly half a decade older than the Hind, and an RAF trainer from 1929, the Tomtit was the first in a line of Hawker aeroplanes to use a steel tube fuselage. With its Rolls-Royce Kestrel engine throttled back, the Hind at last makes its final approach and touches down. The Tomtit now takes to the air. With the Tomtit safely down, we leave Hawkers and turn to de Havilland with the DH-60 Moth. Another de Havilland aeroplane, the Dragon Rapide, begins its display. As we go aloft in the Moth. The Rapide. Miss Kenya, like the Moth and this Rapide, is also from the de Havilland stable. Her less romantic title is the DH-51. The DH-51. Only 3 DH-51s were ever built. One was converted into a seaplane and was lost in Sydney Harbour. Another was scrapped in 1933. But this DH-51, Miss Kenya, the last of her type to be built, was the first aeroplane ever to be registered in Kenya. After an active life of nearly 40 years, in 1965, she returned to the UK for restoration. The DH-60 Moth comes into land. The first monoplane trainer to be ordered by the RAF was the Miles Magister. This all-wooden aeroplane of the mid-1930s is one of only 3 Magisters still flying, although originally over 1,200 were built.
Don't worry, I'm looking at the switches from here.
Landing here at about, well in this wind, around 43 miles an hour. Photo sound technical miles is tricky to be landing.
An aeroplane which saw much military service as a trainer was the DH-82, Tiger Moth. As the clouds of war were gathering on the horizon, the Gloucester Gladiator, last biplane fighter of the RAF, prepared to do battle. Armed with 4 303 Brownings, giving it twice the firepower of its predecessors, this fighter, though obsolete by the beginning of World War II, served both in the Battle of Britain and the defense of Malta. From the Fleet Air Arm Museum comes a visitor to Old Warden, the fairy swordfish. The tiger lands. The swordfish takes off. The Gladiator. The swordfish again. The Gladiator returns to Earth. But the fighter best known on all fronts in World War II was the immortal Spitfire. This is the Shuttleworth Collection's Mark 5C. You'll note it has clipped wingtips. decided not to land the first time, the Spitfire pilot goes round again.
We are